Good evening. Two big British takeover stories have dominated the headlines over the past few days. One now appears to be dead in the water, just 48 hours after offering £115 billion for Unilever. The US food giant Kraft Heinz abandoned its bid, leading to a slump in the latter's shares today. But the other is very much still on. PSA, the owner of Peugeot, remains in advanced talks with GM to take over its loss-making Opel and Vauxhall brands, leading to fears for thousands of British jobs and an urgent question in the Commons.
But the concern will be that this issue of this important company's future in Britain will become collateral damage in wider negotiations and deals regarding Brexit. And in the face of elections in France and Germany this year, does he think that nations will have to engage in an ever-rising bidding game in order to maintain production facilities in their own countries? If so, what will he do for British manufacturing?
The two plants that we've been talking about are amongst the most efficient in Europe and therefore amongst the most efficient in the world. So this is not about altruism. These are successful plants, which is a tribute to their workforce, and they are competitive. We start from a position of strength. And I will, as he would want me to be vigorous in promoting those strengths and into influencing the negotiations so that the excellent workforce that we have there can continue and can go from strength to strength in the future.
Well, Ian Wright, who you saw in that exchange with the Business Secretary Greg Clark, is chairman of the Business Select Committee. He's in our Westminster studio. So, Ian, let's start with Vauxhall. Just how worried are you about these UK plants?
I think we have to be very, very worried about it. I don't want to endanger any potential talks. On the plus side, the British car industry is a real success story. We've got very productive plants, we've got a highly skilled workforce, good industrial relations. It is a massive success story. So in that regard, the Secretary of State is right. We are starting from a position of strength. Having said that, there's overcapacity in the European car market. There are factories in France and Germany that are not as full in terms of capacity as we are in Britain. And the risk is, as I tried to mention in the House today, that because we've got French and German elections, their governments and their potential political candidates will be saying, come here, we'll do sweetener deals, and that will be at the expense of British manufacturing.
But wouldn't that contravene state aid rules?
Well, it's interesting how sometimes, when we were a full member of the EU, we talked about state aid, but France and Germany can seem to get round it. And it is a part of what sort of incentives can be put in place to maintain and enhance production. I do worry about this. I do think it's a concern. And a wider point about Brexit, obviously one of the great attractions for car makers that have got multiple sites across different nations is the existence of the single market. We're not going to be part of that single market. And if you're moving parts of your supply chain, and then moving finished products out, that's going to be a real detriment to what could be built in Britain.
Now, supporters of Brexit, though, might argue that being outside the EU means that we're not covered by state aid rules, and therefore we're free to offer car makers like GM or Peugeot, if they take over Vauxhall, any incentives that we please.
And that's why I said to the Secretary of State today, as part of a good, coordinated industrial strategy that emphasises the importance of British manufacturing and shows some of the strengths in British manufacturing, like our great automotive industry, what are we going to do to be able to back this for the long term? This is not a failing industry, Ian, and it's certainly not a failing company when it comes to British productive capacity. So what are we going to do to enhance this?
So let's turn to Unilever now, Ian. Why do you think Kraft Heinz walked away just 48 hours after going public with this offer?
I don't know, if I'm really honest. I'm not privy to some of the discussions. I would suspect that they were surprised at the vehemence of the opposition coming from Westminster and Whitehall. My understanding, to the government's credit, they were in discussions with the two companies over the weekend and said this is not something that we particularly agree on. And I think Kraft Heinz wanted to not have a hostile takeover, but to have some sort of agreement that simply wasn't on the cards at all.
But do you think if push had come to shove, Ian, that the government actually would have intervened to block Kraft Heinz from buying Unilever?
Well, if not with Unilever, Ian, then when would the government intervene? The government talks about a more active and interventionist industrial strategy that really backs Britain's business. And again, in a similar way to Vauxhall, this is not a failing company. Unilever is incredibly successful, investing for the long term, thinking about where did it need to be in the next 10 or 20 years, investing in research and development, exemplary when it comes to corporate governance. By any stretch of the imagination, this is not a failing company. So given that this could have been what the second biggest takeover in corporate history, and given that it would mean cost cutting and jobs and research and production facilities moved out of the UK, well, I would have thought the government would have had to have acted. But did it have the powers to do so? So I think Theresa May will be mightily relieved that Kraft Heinz moved out of this by their own accord.
But briefly, do you worry that there will be another situation like this? The pound has fallen so much, a lot of UK companies are now sitting ducks for foreign buyers, aren't they?
I do think that, and I do think there's possibilities of fire sales of good, productive, profitable British companies. It's not in the interests for Britain to lose those companies, but because of sterling's fall, we are vulnerable, yes.